national advertising in the digital platform that I provide advice and guidance to. I'm speaking with banks, on things like that. And our firm has a variety of clients really across the space. And cannabis, as you'll hear, is one of those things that really crosses all different areas of law. So I think that's, I guess, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce the fact that I'm a founder and I'm the chairperson of the LA County Bar Association's cannabis section. So I should have included that up front.
Thank you, Josh. Next, let's go to Andrew. Andrew, why don't you tell us a little bit about your practice area and, as Josh had indicated, your involvement in the LAC-BA cannabis section.
Absolutely, and to echo Todd's sentiments, thank you. To echo Joshua's sentiments, thank you, Todd, for organizing this excellent event. My name is Andrew Koussevitzky. I'm an attorney here in Los Angeles, California. I've been practicing in the cannabis space for almost 8 years now. I started actually as a criminal defense attorney representing namely cannabis defendants, many of whom are now my clients who have made the transition from the legacy market into the regulated space. I am the founder of Koussevitzky Law here in Los Angeles. I founded the firm in late 2018. We work with mainly plant touching operators in the space, but not exclusively. Also work with marketing companies as well and other brands and labels throughout the country. I'm also licensed myself in the state of Florida and in the state of New York. So my practice does work with clients in those states as well. Yes, if you're thinking, did this guy subject himself to all 3 of those bar exams? I did voluntarily. I won't take any more, but at one point in my life, I had a different way of doing things, I suppose. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Koussevitzky Law, a lot of licensing in the cannabis space, a lot of regulatory compliance, business transaction work. I would say that's the majority of it. Fortunately, I also have some clients outside of the cannabis space in hospitality and some tech clients as well. But that's the majority of what I do. And I'm also, just to note, of counsel with a couple other firms from outside of California where I help advise and provide counsel to their clients, notably McAllister Garfield in Denver, Colorado. And that's a little bit about myself, and I look forward to speaking with everyone today.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's next go to our next speaker, which is Taylor. Taylor, why don't you tell us your full name, a little bit about your practice area, and your involvement and role with the LAC-BA cannabis section.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Taylor Wagner. I am a deputy city attorney with the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. My only client, so to speak, is the Department of Cannabis Regulation. So I essentially function as one of a handful of in-house counsels for the Department of Cannabis Regulation. When I started in February 2018, cannabis had been legal for about a month in California, and the department had maybe 3 or 4 employees. I like to tell the story that there was an afternoon where I answered the phones because there was no one else to do it. And if you fast forward to today, the department has somewhere between 40 and 50 employees, and Los Angeles is currently the largest legalized market in the world, although probably not for much longer. So it's been a wild ride, and I knew nothing about cannabis coming into this, and some days I feel like I still don't, but it has been a very exciting journey. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Taylor, out of those 40 to 50 people, do any of them answer the phone now?
Yes, there's
okay.
The whole crew that does
Got
that.
to hear it. Perfect. Wonderful. Interesting story. So on that note, let's turn to our next speaker, Maytal. Why don't you tell us your full name and your practice area and about your role on the in the LAC cannabis section.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, my name is Maytal Manzuri, and I'm the managing partner for Manzuri Law. I founded the firm in 2010, And I've been focused primarily on cannabis law in one way or another since law school, pretty much. So my experience is widely varied. I've done a lot of criminal defense. I started out as a federal criminal defender for folks facing 10-year mandatory minimums in federal prison, when a lot of them had medical defenses they were not allowed to present in federal court. I've done a lot of state criminal defense cases. Back in the day, there was something called the collective defense. So I was specialized in that. And then as my clients wanted to comply with the Compassionate Use Act and SB 420, I advised on the collective model and how to protect themselves before getting into court. And that's, slowly evolved into what's largely now a business and corporate and regulatory practice. I would say probably 60% of our practice is regulatory, and about 25% is corporate and transactional, and about 5% is still criminal defense. And I am now, I don't know if it's official yet, but I think I'm the vice chair of communications for LAC-BA, and I sit on the board. I also sit on the board for the International Cannabis Bar Association. I'm very passionate about cannabis law and the legalization efforts. And, we have been involved, like I said, in criminal defense and regulatory, corporate and transactional, even some governmental policy and policy governmental relations. And that's one of the best things about being a cannabis attorney, is you get to do all of these different things and work in various disciplines. You're not sort of pigeonholed into any one area. And our general counsel kind of to a lot of clients and folks, and some coming out of the traditional market, some public companies, some multi-state operators, but mostly plant touching and throughout the supply chain.
Thanks, Mittal. And finally, our speaker, Sheila, why don't you give us your full name, tell us a little bit about what your practice entails and your role within the LACBA cannabis section.
Okay, sorry, I was accepting some notice there. My name is Sheila Gibson. I am a patent and trademark attorney. My technical background is in microbiology and molecular genetics. And I spent I had a brief stint before law school in the biotech industry in a GMP manufacturing facility. I spent the first 16 years of my career at various big law firms, primarily protecting global patent portfolio, or creating global patent portfolios for biotech companies, and very focused in cancer immunology in particular. And in 2015 became very interested in cannabis as medicine, and really wanted to explore that and find out how I could contribute to the cannabis industry. But as with a federal practice, I didn't really see how my skill set translated to cannabis. But as I explored that further, it became very clear that the cannabis industry needed help with intellectual property. And so in 2019, because I was a partner at a national law firm and they weren't quite ready to have cannabis clients yet. So in 2019, I founded my own law firm, Aura IP Law. And now I would say my practice is about 50% patents, actually probably 40% patents, 40% trademarks, maybe 10% IP licensing, and 10% copyrights. And my client base is primarily cannabis clients, although I do still have some of my biotech and agriculture clients who are not in the cannabis space. And I am currently on the executive committee of the LACBA Cannabis Law Section, and also on the board of the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform.
Thank you, Sheila. And I have to say, I mean, it's been very interesting for me just in the few minutes since we've gotten going. I've learned a lot about, my own colleagues on the executive committee. So thanks for sharing more about yourself. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, we do have some questions that we've prepared in advance, but I really want to keep the focus primarily, whenever at all possible, on the questions that our attendees have. So I want to start by opening it up to, does anyone have any initial questions? Okay, on that note, maybe as we go on in time, but most of you touched on it in your introductions. Our speakers touched on it in their introductions largely. But if there's anything else that any of you have to add as far as how and why you got into this practice area. Let's start with Josh.
Yeah, I'll make a comment there. And so some people have been practicing in this space longer than I have. I indicated that it's been about 5 or 6 years. And that was when I could see as a California attorney, and I was reading regularly about what was developing in Colorado. And I thought to myself, there's no way California is going to remain behind on something like the legalization of cannabis. I mean, we had a Compassionate Use Act, but I knew that more was going to happen. And so I really started looking into it and getting interested in it. And then as an attorney, when Prop 64 did pass, and it was then obvious and apparent that there would be, in fact, rules that would be more clear, I was more comfortable getting into the space. So I'm a fairly risk-averse attorney at a big law firm, and it wouldn't really work for me to be, on the tip of the spear in a lot of, what used to be the case with the co-op model in California. There was an attorney general opinion that was really vague. It just didn't give me any kind of comfort. But knowing that there are rules that we can then put in place, it gave me comfort. And that's part of the reason why I got into the space as a whole. And Todd, when there's a chance, I want to touch on the issue of ethics. So it doesn't have to be now, but I just want to make sure that I get the opportunity to address that.
Definitely. I know we talked about that. Absolutely. Maytal, would you like to add anything as far as how and why you got into this practice area?
Yeah, there's, I think, a few reasons as to why I got into this practice area. I'm an advocate, number one. Number two, it was, just such an emerging area for a young attorney. And I was not working at a big law firm. I was working at a small law firm, and saw this as a real opportunity, especially for a young woman. Oftentimes in sort of at least, especially at that time in the bigger law firm landscape, as a young woman, the sort of partner track, or at least an equity partner track, was less of an option. And I think it also goes hand in hand with why I started my own law firm, which was that I wanted to start a family, and I wanted work-life balance, and I wanted all these things for myself. So, something that I was passionate about, had experience in. As a young attorney, I was sort of already an expert only a few years in. And so all of those reasons sort of wrapped up together, I think, is why I chose cannabis law, or cannabis law chose me. I'm not quite sure.
Interesting. Taylor, would you like to add anything as far as how and why you got into cannabis law?
Sure. To be totally candid, this was kind of a fluke for me. I was doing antitrust work at a small firm before this, and I wanted to try something totally new. And cannabis is, like Maytal said, something that's really great for a new attorney. There's not a lot of established rules yet. And so the industry and the lawyers and the regulators are all learning together at the same time. So it was a really unique opportunity at a unique moment in time. So I took it.
Good for you. Sheila, would you like to add anything, how and why?
Definitely. So I mentioned that I was primarily focused in cancer immunology, and I don't know if there are any IP attorneys in here, but patent work in particular is a grind. There's a lot of deadlines, a lot of unhappy PhD clients, and just a lot to deal with. And so one of the things that I did to really stay committed to the bigger picture and keep, all of that at the forefront was I would follow cancer patients whose journeys I could find online, just to stay connected to the why and my purpose in the patent work that I was doing. And one of the patients I started to follow was Sophie Ryan, whose parents were treating her. At the time I started following her, she was about 2. She was diagnosed with cancer at 8.5 months old, and her parents were treating her glioma with cannabis. And I followed her journey real time and just was completely captivated by her and inspired, and it ignited in me a real passion to be part of the cannabis industry. At the time, I thought it meant leaving my practice and starting something completely different. But, when it became clear that you really could make it work with my practice, that made it even more interesting, because with a federal practice, I am constantly, doing legal maneuvering and mental gymnastics around all of the federal rules to get meaningful protection for my clients, which isn't always easy, but it's definitely possible. So there's this added challenge that sort of ignited even a new passion with respect to the work that I had already been doing for so long. So it was a really great fit. I feel like Maytal said, cannabis called me, and really happy to be part of the industry.
Great. And Andrew, anything to add, how or why?
Sure, absolutely. The why probably goes back to just being an advocate. Growing up in South Florida, there were some very strict cannabis laws. I saw friends suffer because of those laws, friends who would get arrested with a joint or a couple of grams for possession, and it would change their entire trajectory for college and potentially career and whatnot. And it was always very easy to spot that was crazy and it shouldn't be that way. And so internally, I've just always had this passion for cannabis, the plant, and seeing that the past wrongs were made right. So that would be the why. The how is very specific. About 3 weeks after I moved to Los Angeles, I received a call from a childhood friend who was arrested for cannabis, possession, transportation. The firm that was representing him needed coverage. I said, "Hey, I'll do it for free. Just give me an interview." And that's kind of how it happened. I started at a small firm that was working with a lot of cannabis clients at the time, and that was about 7.5 years ago, and that is what led me to ultimately starting my own firm.
Very interesting. So Josh, I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to chat about the ethical considerations.
Thank you. So it often comes up, especially for attorneys who are considering the practice, representing businesses involved in the cannabis industry. How do you do it? Being mindful of the fact that it is still federally illegal. So here's the quick CLE portion of today's program, which is that Professional Rules of Conduct Rule 1.2.1 makes it ethical within the state of California to have cannabis clients for attorneys. And there's language in one of the comments that says, that this rule permits a lawyer to advise a client regarding the validity, scope, and meaning of California laws that might conflict with federal or tribal law. There's also a California Bar formal opinion, which is Formal Opinion 2020-202, which is 15 pages and concerns cannabis specifically. So the rule of professional conduct is a bit more broad. This formal opinion addresses cannabis specifically and says it is ethical for attorneys to represent clients in this space. And there is a however, this is in the kind of the conclusion of it. A lawyer may not advise a client to violate federal law or provide advice or assistance in violating state or federal law in a way that avoids detection or prosecution of such violations. The lawyer must also inform the client of the conflict between state and federal law, including the potential for criminal liability and the penalties that could be associated with a violation of federal law. And I'll just mention super quick, in engagement agreements that we have in our engagement agreement a disclaimer that, we are representing you in this space in California, for example, and that you acknowledge that it remains illegal at the federal level and that it is subject to criminal prosecution at the federal level, and we're not advising or supporting you in any way in terms of violating, any federal law. And then I'll mention a very quick kind of cautionary tale that I had alluded to with you before, Todd, which is that there is an attorney in California who a few years ago was in the news because, and I don't know enough of the details at this point, but her client was in the industry, and her client had an operation that had allegedly gone beyond what was lawful in the local jurisdiction. And in the course of her client being investigated, her communications with the client were subjected to a search warrant. And those communications, which are attorney-client communications, became, then the subject of a very large dispute. She was being prosecuted, the attorney, by the local jurisdiction. And in part because there were communications that suggested that she had helped facilitate essentially the client going beyond what was lawful and had actively essentially misled maybe investigators. And so my understanding is that's all been resolved, but for a couple of years, it was a very hot topic for attorneys in California and beyond when we talked about the cannabis industry and talked about representing clients and what about your communications with the client? And her communications were being scrutinized by law enforcement, by the prosecutor's office, essentially as under the crime fraud exception, as I recall it. So I haven't heard any other tales like that. My understanding is that it did get resolved, but it certainly was something that was very concerning and had a lot of industry within the legal community, cannabis legal industry kind of support and interest. So that's it on the ethical part of the program. There's no official CLE credit for today, but just wanted to make sure I got that out pretty early.
Thanks, Josh. So again, we do have a number of prepared questions, but they're optional in the event that some of the attendees don't have questions. So I really want to keep the focus on your questions. So on that note, now that the speakers have chatted a little bit, it looks like, hope I'm not butchering your name. Is it Ania?
Very close. It's Anaya.
Anaya, okay.
Yeah. So my question is specifically for Ms. Mittal, but anyone can answer if they also have any inputs. She mentioned that, well, why am I speaking that way? Ms. Mittal, you mentioned that you were interested in the cannabis space as early as law school. Right now I'm a 1L. Well, I just finished my exam, so I'm rising 2L. And I'm very interested in the cannabis space, but there aren't really any courses or anything that's like directly associated with cannabis, like some of the other established sectors, such as like entertainment law. What did you do to prepare yourself to enter into the cannabis space? And do you have any advice on what I should do now that I'm in that position?
Thanks. Yeah, so I know that some law schools do have like clubs and some courses that you can get involved in, but my advice a lot of times to law students is to actually get experience and training in other areas of the law, because cannabis law is a thing, but really you need to know the other areas, the other disciplines, and then the cannabis. So if it's, cannabis law generally is attached to another sort of subject. So whether it's real estate, land use, like Sheila said, IP, corporate and transactional, regulatory, agency, governmental relations, litigation, criminal defense, I think you kind of have, that the subject is cannabis, but you also have to figure out what part of the industry you're most interested in, or a few of them. So, if you're going to be more on the transactional side, or you're going to be more on the litigation side, if you're interested in the regulatory, there are so many subsets of cannabis law that you could familiarize yourself with, become an expert in, and then you would be a real asset. I think the space is lacking in really strong practitioners in several areas. I think IP is one. Sheila is amazing, but there aren't that many that are really, really well versed in intellectual property. I think land use is a great one as well. That one does have practitioners, but I think it's such an important area of the law that it's worth exploring. Anything in the financial sector is great. There's just so much there. There's so much meat. So it's like, I know in law school, you're always trying to figure out, like, what is it that I want to do? And it sounds like you figured out that you want to be in cannabis law, but I would challenge you to find out, like, what part of cannabis law most interests you. And you can, all of us touch different areas, but I think, there are, within each of us, there are real strengths as to where we practice. So kind of find out what those strengths are for you.
Can I add something to that? I agree with what Maytal just said. And I know that the question that you asked was directed toward, kind of formal, within law school. And I do know that there are some schools that do have some courses. But what I would also mention to you is that there are resources online that you can almost like self-study if you wanted. So for example, if you were to go to there are 3 different California state agencies. The Bureau of Cannabis Control is the lead agency. And if you were to go to the website for the California Bureau of Cannabis Control, you'll find that there's a wealth of information there about the law. There are these kind of like 1 or 2 page, almost like summary sheets that they've prepared that address different areas of the state regulations, and then if you were interested in, Taylor could address this better than me, but I know that the Department of Cannabis Regulation in the city of Los Angeles also has a lot of information on the website. So to the extent that cannabis law is kind of statutory based, meaning the rules, the regulations, the agencies or the jurisdictions that you may be interested in have usually online, information that you could use to kind of start familiarizing yourself with what the rules are that are out there.
And I'll add on the federal
Yes,
side, definitely looking at the FDA. I think the industry is really going to need some FDA regulatory attorneys who are really committed to cannabis. So that would be another one. And then, studying of course, the Farm Bill and the USDA side of things as well. There's a lot going on with the USDA and hemp right now, but it'll expand out, we hope.
I do have another question in the chat, but before I move on to that one, did any of the other speakers, or would any of the other speakers like to add anything?
Can I add something, Todd?
Absolutely.
I personally, from the regulatory side, really wish I paid more attention in business organizations and in like real property or land use, because those 2 things are fundamental to every business in California. you have to have a local license, a license from your city or your county, and then you also have to have a state license. And there's different rules. It's a patchwork depending on where you are. But those two things are really fundamental to every business, no matter what jurisdiction you're in California. And the business organization side of it can be really complicated because of the federal prohibition and the tax implications. It's tricky.
Okay, I think all of our speakers chimed in on that one, except
Todd,
perhaps
if I may
Andrew.
briefly, Todd, just
There you go.
briefly, my just
Read my mind.
advice would be to, if you're able to, and I've actually spoken to some law students recently who've done this, and I thought it was wise, so I'll pass this information along. They're actually working at or interning for cannabis companies in Los Angeles, or if you live in an area currently where there is legal cannabis, go learn from the inside out. You'll really see what a cannabis company does. And I think having that knowledge is extremely important, because I know for a lot of us attorneys, a few years ago, there weren't legal cannabis companies here. So even understanding what those companies do and how they operate and what their day-to-day operations really mean to them and how you can best service them, it actually becomes a huge eye-opening experience, I think. And for me, working with the companies and having the opportunities to go on site and learn about what they do has been great for me. You don't learn that in law school, you really can't. So if you can connect with some local cannabis companies that are licensed and offering programs or job opportunities, I think that's another interesting way to get some real world experience before you jump into the industry, because there's just a lot, as you can tell by each of the 5 speakers have said, there's a lot of ways you can kind of skin this cat. But I think that connect with some companies locally if you have that opportunity.
Thank you, Andrew.
And Todd, I'll just add one more thing about the formal education. I started with CLEs. So I just looked for cannabis CLEs and started attending them just to start getting familiar with the language and the regulations and the people. And that was the first thing I did. I attended a CLE and had no idea what I was doing there, but it did open a lot of doors.
And there are so many CLEs and so many events. I mean, when events become a thing, but you can do like webinars now, and there's so much out there right now. I think cannabis content online is like the most consumed from legal content, is incredibly available. And I echo that too.
Thanks, Maytal. We can certainly move on, but I don't want to rush anyone's comments if any of the other speakers have anything to add.
I'll say this, Anaya, you can subscribe to Maytal's website. There are others, but you can subscribe to Maytal's and you can get updates that Maytal publishes, and she does lunch and learn programs as well. And so to Maytal's point, you can definitely get content through programs, and the LA County Bar Association cannabis section, we do programming as well. We've done quite a bit, so you're welcome to attend our programs as well, of course.
Thanks, Josh. So on that note, we also have a comment in the chat. It was sent directly to me from Dale Nowicki, looks like at the State Bar perhaps. And I'm happy to read it, but Dale, if you'd rather speak to it, I mean, again, I want to make this as informal and interactive as possible.
Certainly, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, this is just piggybacking on Josh's comment with reference to fee agreements. And like I just was reiterating, like you said, always CYA yourself in fee agreements. And in RPC 1.2.1, as well as in Business and Profession Code 6068, they always prevent or prohibit any sort of solicitation, encouragement or enticement, anything like that with reference to criminal acts. So I think if you simply delineate those two, that you're acting within California law and not having anything to do, and recognize that federal law does not recognize cannabis as a legal substance at this time, you're going to be good. Additionally, I think the new U.S. Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has indicated a return to the Cole memo back in the Obama years. So as long as people are acting within the laws of that particular state, if marijuana is legalized in that particular state, then I think they're going to be good.
Can I say something super quick just to add on, just for so that people understand? James Cole was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States back during Obama's presidency, and issued a memo that is known very well within the industry as being the Cole memo. And in it, the U.S. Attorney General identified, here are the federal priorities for prosecution of cannabis-related, crimes, essentially. And those things included like transporting cannabis across state lines, guns and cannabis, things that were getting into like drug trafficking, those kinds of things. They were a list of 9 priorities that for years was kind of like okay, so long as we don't touch on these things, the federal government's not going to look at us and not going to really care. Jeff Sessions became the Attorney General, rescinded the Cole memo, but never took actions really that were inconsistent with the Cole memo. It seemed to be more of a, kind of like a flag waving, kind of a symbolic gesture on their part to rescind it. And it still kind of is out there and respected by many. So if you hear references to the Cole memo, it's a document. I've got it on my computer. You can find it easily. That's what people are referring to, and it's this list of 9 priorities that would be worthy of the federal government prosecuting, essentially.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, likewise. And so on that note, I want to open it up again or back again for any other attendee questions. Again, I have a number of prepared questions, but I'd rather keep the focus on what you would most like to hear about.
I do have a question.
Thanks, Shiva.
So earlier in my career, I had a city as a client, and I had helped prepare their policies for like cannabis use and cannabis development in the city. I just kind of wanted to know the interactions between attorneys and their clients regarding getting those permits and the availability to do business in cities.
Okay, my sense is Taylor would have a very interesting perspective on that for starters, and then I'll open it up to the other speakers as well. Taylor?
Sure. I think Maytal would also have a good point of view on this too, because she has clients that are going through at least the licensing process in the city of LA. It's complicated. It's complicated because of the way California structured cannabis licensing. I mentioned this earlier, but you have to have a state license, and then you have to have a license from your county or your city. Not every county or city has even chosen to regulate cannabis. Some have just a blanket ban. Some have chosen to regulate only certain activities or only medicinal cannabis. So it's very complicated, and you have to be very aware of where the business is that's seeking a license. The other thing is that the state has 3 separate agencies that regulate cannabis depending on the type of business. The state is currently supposed to be consolidating those 3 agencies this summer into a single granddaddy agency, and that will cause further confusion because they have some rules that overlap that'll need to be tightened up, and we may even see a big regulatory change just because they have the opportunity to do it. So it's tricky. Yeah, I think, and the other thing is when the state adjusts their rules, that causes a ripple effect where all the cities that are using the state's framework as a guide then have to adjust their rules as well. So there's a lot in flux. Last summer in the city of LA, we rewrote about half of our cannabis procedures ordinance. And it was a massive overhaul in an attempt to address the real world challenges of what was happening on the ground, and to try to conform the regulatory scheme to what was actually happening or what was going to be actually feasible. Because this is all new, there's a lot of give and take between the regulators, the industry, and the lawyers. We all have to figure it out together. And a lot of the changes that we made last summer to our regulatory scheme in LA were taken from like thoughtful questions and comments that we had gotten from applicants who were facing different scenarios. So that sort of feedback can be helpful and welcomed if it's in a constructive, professional way. We also get a lot of angry, complaints as well, but that's the name of the game. So Maytal, do you have anything to add? Or many of you have clients going through the regulatory process as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it perfectly, Taylor. It's very complicated, and obviously because there's so many different cities and counties throughout the state of California, and reconciling the local with the state can be quite complicated. I remember when West Hollywood first came out with its licensing scheme, it was incredibly progressive, but what happened was the state had changed a lot of the rules after West Hollywood had started its licensing program, and folks had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars applying in West Hollywood. And then a lot of the provisions in the West Hollywood law was in direct contradiction to the state. And so their business plans weren't even viable, and they're still dealing with that by, as an example, the edibles lounges, they can't add cannabis to the edibles directly, unless it's, you've got homogeneity, which you can't really do fresh baked products in that way. You can't sell non-medicated or regular food together with cannabis products. So it's all very complicated. And so I think, when Prop 64 was passed, that was a big concession between the locals and the state to support the ballot, the ballot initiative was to allow for local control. And while we understand that it's complicated and muddied the waters incredibly, and largely Southern California has stayed pretty much closed to new cannabis businesses. Recently, we've seen that changed a little bit in certain Orange County cities, some, in the Inland Empire. I think with COVID, a lot of local governments are hurting financially, and cannabis is now looking to be a little bit more attractive because of the tax revenue that it might bring. And so that has actually contributed to some cities that otherwise were opposed to cannabis to opening up. But it's, I've worked, for example, in Santa Barbara, where, the process has gone through so many different iterations, and so many different politicians and, operators can be left, or, business hopefuls can be left holding down property for years before they even see the license or become operational. And so it's a high risk environment, and it's a high cost, and it's not as profitable as it used to be because of all the taxes and the compliance costs related to it. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And but we do see more cities opening up. I would say that Northern California in general is a little bit more permissive than Southern California, but the market in Southern California is larger, meaning the actual dollars and the commerce. And so it's kind of an interesting position where in Northern California, it's maybe a little bit easier to get a license, but the market is smaller. And in Southern California, it's a lot more difficult. I still think Los Angeles is probably one of the better places to apply because there are options, you know, manufacturing and distribution. You really just need a property to apply, you know, to get the license. There's not a cap or anything like that, you know, and, you know, there's so many other factors to consider, but that's kind of my general sort of broad overview, but I'm open to more specific questions, and I'm sure the other panelists have other great, great things to contribute.
Thanks,
Thank
Matal.
you.
Oh, no, please.
Oh no, I was just thank you. That yeah, because just when I was helping with the advisory, it was just there were so many different policies and so many different cities that we just pulled examples from. So I was just curious to see how it was being dealt with.
There is
Thanks.
a state, I think it's a bill that sort of proposes like a model rule for locals, which I really appreciate that effort. I don't think it has moved much further along in the process yet, but I think that's a great approach of sort of like, here you go, if you want to allow cannabis, here's a model rule. And I thought that was an innovative and great idea. Every city that tends to open up also tends to get sued. So it's kind of like this, you know, not only do they not want cannabis, if they do accept cannabis, they're, you know, probably going to be sued by somebody who wants more shops, who wants less shops, who lost in the process, who, you know, whatever their claim may be.
Does anyone of the other speakers have anything they might like to add? Okay, well, thanks. And opening it back up to our attendees. I know some of the attendees who I'm acquainted with have asked me offline a little bit about they're an attorney and they're interested in getting involved in this space. I think that some of the speakers touched on it earlier, but is that something, do any of these speakers have anything to add to that? How you might get into this practice area as a new attorney, a recently barred attorney? Anything further? Or perhaps another idea or another thought I had was, to the extent that we're all on the LACBA Cannabis Section Executive Committee, a little bit about, you know, ways to get involved in this section.
Sure. So I will say, I guess it kind of depends, to the first question, it kind of depends where you are. So if you're at a firm that doesn't support, you know, the cannabis industry and isn't going to start opening up their practice to supporting the industry, then obviously you have to educate yourself, and if you're passionate about it, you know, kind of expect to look elsewhere at some point in your career. I mean, my prior law firm, I've been at different law firms in my career. The most recent one before Ackerman did not support the cannabis industry, and it happened, the timing of things for me was quite good that Ackerman had just initiated a, you know, something. So that's one thing. The other obviously is that many people, including some of our panelists, you know, have gone out and, you know, been leaders and created their own law firm. And so that's something clearly, I mean, Sheila spoke to that. So it kind of depends on where you're at, you know, and then there's the issue of, like I said earlier, I think of self-study. In terms of the cannabis section of the LA County Bar Association, I mean, we have, I don't want to misquote, I think there may not be a charge for barristers or young attorneys to be a part of our section. You guys, the barristers and young attorneys might know this better than me. There is normally for, I think, an attorney like myself, I think it's $50 a year to be a part of the cannabis section. So far, all of our programming has been non-pay during COVID. So all of our programming has been widely available. You know, and then there are other organizations out there that exist. So there's the, and Maytal mentioned this, she's on the board of the International Cannabis Bar Association. And there are other places where people can learn, but in terms of, you know, practicing, unless you're on your own and you're gonna, you know, do that, you obviously are a bit at the mercy of your employer.
Thank you, Josh. I do want to add, I've been licensed for about a year and a half at this point, and I believe it's $25 as a barrister young attorneys section member. I believe within your first few years of practice, off the top of my head, your LACBA membership is free and your barristers young attorneys section membership is free, and each additional section after that, I think the first 2 sections after that, if I'm not mistaken, $20 or $25, somewhere in that ballpark. You can check with member services if you're interested with LACBA, but that's the best of my recollection. On that note, any other questions from the? I want to keep it very open and informal and fun, interactive.
Hi, everyone. I have a question. Thank you.
Thanks. Absolutely.
So I'm a newer attorney. I've been in practice about 3 years. I'm currently working in an environmental land use attorney, but before, with just starting out, I started at a small cannabis boutique firm. So I have little experience in that realm, but I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on where you see the cannabis market growing next that would require a need for new regulation. Like, are there trends that you see, like cities opening up, like West Hollywood has for on-site consumption? Or do you see like cannabis tours coming to California like they have in Denver? Or do you see most cities just revising their current cannabis ordinances or adopting new ones because they haven't entered the space yet?
I'll start, and I'll say this, and this, I'm not answering your primary question first, but I'm touching on something else, which is that as far as attorneys go, and Maytal mentioned this a bit earlier, one of the areas that's going to be an opportunity, or is a very big opportunity, is in CEQA compliance. And so if you're at a land use firm currently, CEQA, you know, is probably going to be, you know, a pretty good, it's going to be a busy area for cannabis. I don't know if it's really hit as much as it will, but that's an area that will require a lot of attorney help. But to your question specifically about kind of new markets, you know, my attitude on that is really more, I'm looking beyond California. I mean, I think what we see nationally is just new states coming online, new markets in outside of California seems to be kind of the dominant news story, not necessarily cities opening up, but I'll leave it to somebody else, you know, maybe Maytal or Andrew can talk more about local jurisdictions and specific changes that they see.
Well, Josh, that's interesting that you say that, because I am actually practicing the CEQA space right now. And so I was wondering about that because I know SB 59, I'm not sure if that's going to pass or not, but I know SB 59 would extend the CEQA, whatchamacallit, can't think off the top of my head. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So maybe you guys can speak to more on that instead of my initial question. Thank you.
Can I chime in here? So currently, I think you probably know this, but currently the whole industry has been operating under a CEQA exemption that's expiring July 1st. And that is causing a lot of chaos over here. Because I think the city of LA and a lot of jurisdictions are not quite ready to take that on yet. But we're watching very eagerly to see what happens with that bill, because it'll make a huge difference. I mean, it's not just that that the businesses are going to have to contribute to a CEQA analysis, but the city has to come up with a framework to do so and figure out where in the licensing process that's going to happen. And it's uncharted territory at this point, and we're looking at a cliff on July 1st. That's going to be a really abrupt change from how things have been operating. So I think you should stay put. I think you're in the perfect place. You're perfectly situated, whether it expires July 1st or January 1st or, you know, whenever. You're going to be really well positioned to get into that part of the cannabis realm.
Thanks. Fingers crossed. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Taylor. Would any of our additional speakers like to add anything, perhaps?
Andrew here. Yeah, sure. Couldn't agree more with Taylor. You're positioned perfectly. CEQA, especially for a lot of my cultivation clients up north, it's a constant consideration. It's something we're dealing with all the time. In law school, I definitely didn't think I would spend a week researching native frogs and grasslands and how we can work with the regulatory agencies to preserve those little great creatures up there. But you know, outside of that, one area that to go to your original question, one area that I think will actually be pretty important in the coming years, oddly at the moment not important at all, but I think the event space, you're going to see a lot of growth in the cannabis event space. Licensing is a lot less obstructive than some of the other activities, but notwithstanding that, I think there's going to be a demand for it. And as cannabis becomes more accepted by sporting leagues and entertainers and celebrities, you're going to see a lot more cross promotion between you know, brands and celebrities and using their likeness in the cannabis space. And I think ultimately that's going to lead to more live events. I think that all of that will probably converge in the next year or two and start to pick up, probably, you know, impending. I think that'll be a new area to explore. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity in that area. So just another interesting space that I'm keeping an eye on personally. But I love the environmental angle. It's certainly, I mean, it's needed already. There's already a gaping hole, and I think that's only going to continue to grow. So good on you. Thank you for the question.
The only thing I would
Please.
add is psychedelics. I think that's you know, not exactly cannabis law, but I think that you're going to have the Department of Cannabis and Mushrooms regulators here at some point. So I think and there's the Psychedelics Bar Association too, that you can look into. So I think that's really interesting. Some people say that, you know, mushrooms and psychedelics today is kind of like cannabis, you know, maybe 2013-ish. So, you know, if you want to be ahead of the game, I would just study up on that and make sure you get your Google alerts on for that, as it's, I think, a coming practice area here pretty soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maytal. Would anyone else like to add anything on that one? I know for myself, I'm a little, I might have missed it, but is CEQA an acronym?
Yes, it stands for the California Environmental Quality Act.
Okay, maybe I missed it before. Thanks. Okay, so on that note, anyone else? I dropped it in the chat, and I do have a message that I'll respond to in a moment directly, but if there's any other questions that come to mind, you're welcome to send them through the chat if you're more comfortable, and I'll ask on your behalf. Perhaps from another law student. Okay. Well, on that note, I know one of the questions that the speakers and I had come up with was a little bit about what do you see as the future here of cannabis law, or what concerns might you have for the future of California cannabis lawyers. I know that we've touched on it a little bit, just sort of organically, but if any of our speakers have anything to add.
I'll start, and I'll just say that the crystal ball remains pretty murky. Obviously, new states are coming online, so to speak, and as states come online, some states are moving from medicinal to adult use / recreational. And so that seems to be, that's continuing. I mean, it's just, I get email alerts and, news about the next 3 states that are going to be, legalizing in one form or another. At the federal level, it seems pretty slow, but there is national news, developments within Congress. But I think it's still going to be a while away. I don't think anybody's expecting that, suddenly cannabis is going to be federally legal. I suspect my take on it would be that if something big happens at the federal level, that the federal government would essentially defer to the states to a great extent and allow the states to run their own programs as they are currently, and that the federal government will just kind of like, I'm not sure how it would be. It gets too complicated as soon as I talk about like Schedule 2 or Schedule 4, we start getting into a deep dive. So I'm not sure there. Concerns, I don't have any particular concerns. I mean, I voiced the one thing that as a cautionary tale that kind of sticks out there, and just as Dale Nowicki had said, CYA and be smart and be careful. That's it.
Would anyone like to add anything? Perhaps Taylor from the regulatory side? I know you touched on it, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've pretty much covered the whole spectrum here. I think you'll see more states come online. I think you'll see an expansion of license types to events and consumption lounges and that kind of thing. I think also on the federal level, what I'm really interested in is the Safe Banking Act, which has been introduced and reintroduced and reintroduced. And every time it seems to get a little more momentum. So that would really be a game changer for a lot of businesses who don't have access to traditional banking services. They can't take out loans. They can't do a lot of what would a normal, shoe store would be able to do. So that would really change a lot, and it would change a lot for the city. I mean, we have a grant program that we established for our social equity program. And because cannabis is still federally prohibited, we as a city had a difficult time finding a bank to administer the grant program, which is just bananas. So I think that would change. That would be like the single biggest thing that I think would change from a regulatory perspective that's on the horizon. I think you'll also see a lot more social equity programs develop as states choose to regulate cannabis. They'll probably incorporate social equity as part of that. California doesn't have a statewide program, but many cities have adopted different variations of a social equity program, which is intended to sort of compensate for the harms of past cannabis criminalization. In the city of LA, it does that by giving priority to applicants who have had cannabis arrests or convictions or have lived in a low income area, that sort of thing. So there have been sort of mixed results. It's really difficult to implement something like that in a city of 4 million people or a county of 10 million. I think the smaller jurisdictions like Oakland and San Francisco have had they have a more robust social equity program at this point in time, but we're trying to get there.
Thanks, Taylor. On that note, I wanted to give Sheila an opportunity to talk a little bit about some interesting things going on in her firm.
Thanks so much, Todd. It just occurred to me that I have an audience of young lawyers who also know other young lawyers, and our law firm is hiring a patent attorney Actually, you don't have to be a patent attorney, but do have to have a life sciences or engineering background, entry-level position. So if you know of anyone who, if you or anyone may be interested, it's posted on Indeed. If you look for Aura IP Law on Indeed, or for an entry-level patent agent or patent attorney position in the cannabis space, you'll find it there.
Thanks, appreciate it. Thanks, Sheila. And I was interested, I mean, some of the speakers touched on it, but as far as the differing requirements within, let's say at the local level, but generally speaking, under current state law, what are the parameters of legal cannabis? It's probably a broad question, but speaking, if we could, in generalities.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that some of the speakers touched on at the local level, there are often requirements, and at the state level, there are often requirements. Sometimes they are consistent, sometimes not so much. So generally speaking, at the state level, what are maybe some of the I know this is probably a broad question, but what are the parameters, generally speaking, of state legal requirements? Right? Does that make sense? Or some of the most common issues that come up in terms of compliance at the state level, to the extent that the local level varies so much, right?
I think I'll answer the easy part of this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe I'm not experienced enough to frame it exactly right, but hopefully you can glean what might be helpful.
The easy answer to this is that you have to be permitted at the local level. So you got to start, you do have to start there. And so California is a dual licensing state. So yes, there can be differences between state and local, but in order to get a state license, you have to demonstrate that you have local permission. And so your first kind of set of hoops, so to speak, is going to be your local jurisdiction. So I'll let maybe Maytal or Andrew, address the harder part of that, perhaps, if there are other specific parameters to be mindful of at the state level.
The state application process is really just kind of you have to just follow all the steps and the regulations closely. I think the things that I see hold most people up in that process are things like premises diagrams, and that's kind of one of the things that needs to be the most detailed and the most specific. And when we usually get the most sort of like bounce back at the state level. I think there's also a lot of planning that needs to be involved. I think Taylor had mentioned earlier that the agencies are going to consolidate eventually, but something I always encourage people to do is to plan. And if they plan to do 3 or more activities, it might be a good opportunity to apply for a micro business as opposed to 3 separate licenses, depending on what your future plans are. So I always encourage folks to think about that. And that's like sort of the initial like application period, but then a lot of times we get inspections and there's a lot of times violations from the inspections, and the state agencies right now are pretty forgiving, and just kind of, you have to do what's called a corrective action plan. So if you get a violation, you have to show that you're fixing everything that you violated on. But it's just a lot of detail. So you just have to really cross your T's and dot your I's, or you find yourself in a mess. And I think by nature, for some reason, of cannabis operators, and maybe entrepreneurs in general, they're very big picture. And so that can be a challenge for a lot of operators. And so, my team is like constantly reminding deadlines, details. We are doing a lot of chasing because our clients are sometimes just kind of left without the capacity to follow through on some of the compliance stuff. So I don't know if that directly answers your question. I think, I think there's the hurdles to getting a license, and then there's the compliance portion. And then obviously, some folks are getting caught up when they are licensed and then moving some product outside of the licensed market, which is a big issue in the space. And, that's when the enforcement becomes a little bit more serious and real from the state, from the state's perspective. And I've dealt with these investigators. A lot of them are basically cops, and it's, they're no joke about it. So that's, kind of some issues that we see.
Thanks, Maytal. We do have just a few minutes left, and I just wanted to give one more opportunity. We probably have time for one more question from an attendee. Okay, if not, then I think a final question that might be interesting is either, and maybe like a quick soundbite on, is there anything you don't like about the practice area that you might caution a new or young attorney who's interested in getting involved?
I'll start. Payment is challenging, and also many of the clients are so far less sophisticated, I think. And so I think that one of the changes in the future as things get more legal is that there might be more sophisticated, but California has a lot of clients in the space and a lot of not very sophisticated folks in the space. And so those would be the maybe the headaches or some of the frustrations I have.
Thanks, Josh. Anyone else care to chime in?
I think for me, just the basic tension that you have when you're unleashing an entire industry on the biggest economy in the country. I think there's going to be pain for both sides, for the regulators, for the operators, and just navigating through that process can be exhausting, and definitely managing client expectations in this industry. A lot of our clients did come from the legacy and the market, and making the transition is not very comfortable for them. Like Maytal said, taxes, regulatory compliance costs, these are all new ideas, and no one necessarily loves those. So, managing clients in this space can client expectations in this space can definitely, become a chore at sometimes. But ultimately, I think you find the same stresses that you would in any other industry. So overall, I don't necessarily have many complaints. I'm quite happy being a cannabis attorney in Los Angeles.
Thanks, Andrew. Anyone else of our other speakers care to chime in?
I would just say, yeah, I would echo what everyone else said, and also that my clients don't always listen to me, which can be frustrating. You spend all this time and and their money to giving them this wonderful legal advice, and it just kind of goes in one ear and out the other.
I'm not sure if Taylor, did you mention?
What I like about it, or what I don't like about it, is also what I like about it. It is very difficult to feel comfortable. You're not going to master anything because it's always changing. So that keeps it exciting, but it also keeps it kind of, you have to guess, and you have to have some tolerance for risk and uncertainty, which are not very lawyerly qualities. Most of the time you're like, oh, I'm going to find the answer on Westlaw or Lexis. This is not an area of law that has answers with any certainty yet. So you have to be able to tolerate that sort of risk and change.
That's very interesting. Thanks for that insight, Taylor.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with what Taylor said. That was probably the most uncomfortable thing for me transitioning into this space, is you have to be comfortable being very uncomfortable and just not knowing. So that was a really difficult thing for me in the transition. And I think, definitely being passionate about why you're doing it helps, because otherwise I think it would be hard to stay in this sort of, and just the constant flux. I mean, I file something one way one month and it's acceptable, and the next month it's not, or I look back at things I filed a year ago and it's like, why did I file it that way? So it's just, it's the constant state of growth and unknowing and change.
Okay, I'm not sure if we got all of our speakers and their insights on that. Did I miss anyone, or did all of you get a chance to chat? Okay. We are at 1:15, so I think we're able to go over by a few minutes by LACBA's parameters. But if any of our speakers need to get going or any of our attendees need to get going, we certainly understand. I do have a few questions that were sent directly to me in the chat. So if you want to try to do a quick run through those, perhaps we can close it out with a quick soundbite. So one question is, what does marketing in this space look like?
For me, it's been a lot of speaking, blog writing, Instagram, just sort of providing educational content. And that's been the best source of marketing for me.
Okay. All right. Perhaps in the interest of time, we'll just do maybe like a quick round robin. Another question I have is, does this practice of law affect attorney liability insurance because it's a new area? Anyone want to take that one?
I don't know the answer to that. I feel like I should, but perhaps because of the structure of the firm I work at, I don't have to deal with it. I would assume that it does, however, and I would, be careful.
I thought it would when I started my firm, but surprisingly, and I don't know if it's because my practice is actually federal and it's IP, and IP is already the most expensive to insure. But my IP insurer knows that I'm practicing in cannabis, but because it's at the federal level, and I guess they figure I'm not doing anything that would be federally illegal, I didn't have any trouble with the insurance.
Okay, thanks. And then we also have a question. Looks like Dale was hoping to pose a question.
Yeah, just real quickly, and I appreciate you staying over. And this for any panel member, is your practice all transactional, or is there any sort of litigation involved, or even with administrative agencies?
So I'll take that. I am a litigator, but I don't deal with administrative law litigation. So mine are commercial disputes. I have one in arbitration right now. I've had others, and that's an active area.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Anyone else want to, because it sounds like Dale was hoping to get a little bit of a cross section.
So in my firm, we don't litigate, but I am of counsel with firms where I do litigate alongside those firms. So my situation is a little unique, but specifically within Koussevitzky law, no litigation, but I do from time to time participate.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Can I
Please, absolutely.
There's quite a lot of litigation against the jurisdictions, including the city of LA. We get sued pretty regularly by disgruntled applicants who were rejected in the licensing process or who didn't like some change to the regulatory scheme. There's also an administrative appeals process internally within the city if you have a license denied or renewal denied, and you do have to exhaust your administrative remedies. So there is, I think, a lot of room for litigation in the private sector. And there's a lot of room for like some good white collar lawyers to do that too. In the beginning, when I first started this job, we got sued a lot by criminal defense lawyers who were not used to practicing in the civil realm or doing any sort of writ practice. And I think that's slowly starting to change, but there's still a lot of room there.
And
Thanks,
similar to what
Please.
Andrew answered, my firm doesn't do any litigation, but we do pre-litigation, and we are advising on litigation, primarily in the trademark space. There hasn't been very much cannabis litigation in the patent space, but there have been two that all the patent attorneys have been watching, and so far the federal courts have entertained them.
Thanks, Sheila. And then the last one actually seems like a great question to close it out with. I think that all of the speakers touched on it here and there in their various responses, but if you had anything to add as far as what's an average day look like for you, to the extent that there is an average day.
So my average day, it's pretty varied because I just have so many different matters that I deal with. Cannabis, to answer it with respect to cannabis, I've got an active matter that's in arbitration right now. So a lot of it is dealing with the litigation aspects in that regard. Or it might be, the other day, I'll say it was enjoyable. The national media company that I represent sent me videos that they needed essentially a set of eyes on, to make sure that these ads can run online. And so I had the opportunity, and I was checking some of the disclaimers that were in the video. There were some disclaimers, and I was checking those against the statutes to make sure that they were compliant.
Thanks, Josh. Sheila, day in the life?
Average day for me, a lot of phone calls. I feel like I spend a lot more time on the phone than I used to, primarily because a lot of times I'm trying to tease out, especially for my plant touching businesses, I'm trying to tease out the areas that I can protect at the federal level. And also there's a lot more education. I feel like my clients in the cannabis industry, a lot of them, this is their first time. We have a lot of new entrepreneurs. This is their first time in entrepreneurship. So it's a lot of education. So I spend a lot of time on the phone with clients, and a lot of time just looking things up. Again, with the kind of being comfortable with unknowing, just trying to research and figuring out the best solution to the problems that I'm presented with, or calling colleagues and seeing how they would approach things. So I would say that's what's different than my first 16 years in practice.
Thanks, Sheila. Any other speakers want to chime in? Day in their life.
Sure, I'll jump in here. My 4-year-old recently asked me if what I do for a profession is just send emails. So it's Sheila's right. It's a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls, especially with the work from home for the past year. You're kind of doing that from your house. So it's been an interesting transition, but the work's remained pretty much the same. And if not, has picked up for most of us. I know that we had that conversation really. But just a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails. As a solo practitioner, I try to make it a habit to have time set aside for business development, and also for admin work for within the firm. So I try to, segment some of my week to dedicate towards that. But for the most part, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of Zoom, more and more now since the world is opening back up and people are getting vaccinated and it's becoming safer to do so. I'm kind of trying to get back out there and just meet people face to face. That was always something that I actually enjoyed about being in the cannabis space so much. Was it was a very social practice. There was a lot of opportunities to go out, meet your clients, meet your colleagues, your fellow attorneys. And I know we all probably miss that to some extent. And so implementing that into my day-to-day is also something I like to do. And especially living here in California, it's great to get out a little bit, be in the sun and see your clients. So
I think Taylor may be the only one. Day in the life, care to share?
Sure. I feel like to Andrew's emails, I go to meetings. There's a lot of meetings in the regulatory space because it requires a lot of collaboration between and amongst agencies, both like internally with the city, the fire department, the Department of Building and Safety, and then on the state level as well. So there's also a lot of meetings with our council members and the executive staff of the Department of Cannabis Regulation, because it takes quite a bit to take an idea and put that into the law, and then put the law into implementation. And it's every little move that's ever made by any of these jurisdictions is the first time that it's been done. So there are a lot of legal and policy consequences to every step along the way. So it's a lot of meetings.
Thanks, Taylor. On that note, that's a great segue into thank you everyone for joining our meeting, both the attendees and our speakers. We really appreciate your valuable time. Again, my name is Todd Berman. I'm the section liaison on behalf of the Barristers Young Attorney section to the LAC-BA Cannabis section. If you're interested in getting involved in the Barristers Young Attorney section, I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat here. And on that note, thank you again for joining us today. We really enjoyed it and really very informative. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone. Thank you, Todd. Have a great day.
Likewise.
Thank you.